I was asleep. It was the middle of the night. I heard my mom scream my name.
You are under arrest for the murder of your mother.
No one will tell me anything that's going on.
Okay.
On the morning of September 13th, 2006, boaters in Newport Harbor, California, made a grisly discovery. A body was floating in the water, wrapped tightly in a blanket, secured with duct tape. When police pulled it from the harbor, the extent of the violence became clear. The victim, 56-year-old Barbara Mullenix, had been stabbed more than 50 times. Her wrists were bound. She had been dumped like garbage. At first, investigators suspected a robbery gone wrong. Barbara lived in Huntington Beach, an affluent coastal city. But when they dug deeper, the trail didn't lead to burglars or strangers. It led to her own teenage daughter, 17-year-old Rachael Mullenix. Rachael grew up in Southern California, in a middle-class home. To outsiders, she looked like a normal suburban teenager, intelligent, attractive, a girl with a future. But inside the home, things were unraveling. Barbara had raised Rachael largely on her own, and she was strict. Friends later described her as controlling and sometimes suffocating. The two fought constantly. Barbara grounded Rachael, restricted her movements, and disapproved of her choices. Their arguments often turned explosive. By 2006, the conflict had intensified. Rachael had fallen for Ian Allen, a 21-year-old drifter with a sketchy reputation. Barbara despised him. She thought he was too old, too unstable, and dangerous for her daughter. She forbade Rachael from seeing him. At one point, she even went so far as to lock Rachael inside the home to keep her away from him. To Barbara, she was protecting her daughter. To Rachael, she was a tyrant. The resentment festered. Rachael wanted freedom. She wanted Ian, and she saw her mother as the obstacle standing in the way. According to prosecutors, that's when a plan began to take shape. In the early hours of September 13th, Barbara was ambushed in her own home. Ian Allen carried a knife. Rachael knew what was about to happen. The attack was frenzied. Barbara was stabbed more than 50 times, her body riddled with wounds. Many were defensive, showing she had fought desperately for her life. Others were deep plunges into her chest and torso, showing rage and persistence. After the killing, Rachael and Ian wrapped Barbara's body in a blanket, secured it with duct tape, and shoved it into the trunk of her car. They drove south toward Newport Beach, a short distance from Huntington. In the darkness, they dragged Barbara's body out and rolled it into the harbor. They may have thought the body would sink. Instead, it floated to the surface, discovered the very next morning. When investigators pieced together Barbara's final hours, suspicion quickly shifted to her daughter. Detectives noted Rachael's absence. She was nowhere to be found. Days later, police learned that Rachael and Ian had fled California in Barbara's car, heading east. The nationwide manhunt didn't take long. Within a week, police in Louisiana spotted the stolen vehicle. After a high-speed chase, both Rachael and Ian were arrested. She was just 17 years old, sitting in the back of a patrol car, accused of murdering her mother. Back in California, the case became headline news. A beautiful teenage girl accused of conspiring with her older boyfriend to kill her mother was a story that fascinated the public. Reporters packed the courtroom when Rachael first appeared before a judge. Her demeanor shocked many. She didn't cry. She didn't look broken. At times, she appeared detached, even annoyed, as though the trial was an inconvenience. The prosecution painted her as manipulative and cold-hearted. They argued that she wanted her mother dead because Barbara stood in the way of her relationship with Ian. They showed the jury the brutality of the crime scene photos. More than 50 stab wounds, blood spattered across the home. They pointed to the calculated steps afterward, wrapping the body, dumping it in the harbor, fleeing across the country. The defense tried to shift the blame onto Ian Allen. They described him as controlling and violent, claiming he acted alone and that Rachael was caught in his orbit. They argued she was just a scared teenager, manipulated by an older man. But prosecutors counted that Rachael wasn't a bystander. She was a willing partner. She fled with him. She helped cover up the crime. During the trial, family members of Barbara gave emotional testimony. They described Barbara as a woman who had flaws, but loved her daughter fiercely, who worked hard to provide for her, and who never imagined that her child could betray her in the most final way possible. In 2008, the verdict came down. Ian Allen was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. Rachael was convicted of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to 25 years to life in prison. She was 19 years old when she learned she would spend decades behind bars. The case left the community shaken. Barbara's neighbors in Huntington Beach spoke of their disbelief. How could a daughter kill her mother, stab her dozens of times, and then calmly drive away? Media outlets called her the harbor killer. To the public, the image of a teenage girl helping to dump her mother's body in the water was unforgettable. Even in prison, Rachael's story continued to attract attention. Some argued she had been manipulated by Ian Allen, that her youth made her vulnerable. Others insisted she was just as guilty, that her cold demeanor in interviews showed a lack of remorse. Today, Rachael remains incarcerated in California. She will be eligible for parole one day, but her name is forever tied to one of Southern California's most shocking parricides. What makes the case of Rachael Mullenix so haunting is not just the violence, but the betrayal. A daughter, just 17 years old, turned against the woman who raised her. She chose love for a troubled boyfriend over loyalty to her mother. And in doing so, she destroyed 2 lives. Barbara's, brutally ended in a harbor, and her own, condemned to decades in a prison cell. A teenage girl who should have been preparing for her senior year of high school instead became a convicted murderer. And the image of her mother's body, bound, stabbed, and floating in the water, ensures that the name Rachael Mullenix will never be forgotten.
When you called her back, what did she say to you first?
Hey, Nikki, just want to let you know again, we love you, miss you, we're going to see you soon. And then she just was quiet for a second, and then she said, I'm going to miss you, Joey. And I said, what do you mean? And then she got quiet again, and then she says, I shot him. I said, you did what? Like, I shot Mom and Bob.
In August 2015, the quiet suburbs of Tampa, Florida, became the backdrop for one of the most shocking parricide cases in recent American history. 21-year-old college student Nicole Nachtman murdered both her mother and stepfather in cold blood. The brutality of the crime, combined with her detached demeanor in court, cemented her place among the most infamous killer daughters. Nicole was the daughter of Miriam De Leon, a Tampa mother known for her strict and domineering parenting style. Friends and family described Miriam as controlling, someone who demanded perfection from her daughter. She micromanaged Nicole's life, especially her academic career. Nicole was enrolled at Florida State University, but she struggled with depression and social isolation. Those who knew her said she seemed overwhelmed by her mother's constant pressure and disapproval. Her stepfather, Robert De Leon, was a retired Navy captain. Known as Bob, he was respected in his community and was remembered as disciplined, orderly, and firm. Together, Miriam and Robert represented the authority figures Nicole resented. To Nicole, their home wasn't a safe haven, it was a prison. By the summer of 2015, Nicole's resentment had festered into rage. Prosecutors would later describe how years of feeling trapped, belittled, and micromanaged boiled over into murder. On the night of August 20th, Nicole returned to her mother's home in Tampa. She carried a loaded handgun. Her stepfather, Robert, was the first to encounter her. According to the state's case, Nicole raised the weapon and shot him in the back of the head. He collapsed instantly, dead before he hit the floor. Moments later, she confronted her mother. Miriam screamed and begged for her life, but Nicole showed no mercy. She fired multiple rounds into her mother, killing her inside the home. The crime scene photographs later presented in court showed the violence of the attack. Robert shot execution style, Miriam riddled with bullets. When police arrived after concerned neighbors reported gunshots, what they found was chilling. The bodies of both parents lay in the home, no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a burglary. It became clear almost immediately that this was an inside job. Suspicion turned quickly to Nicole. Detectives tracked her down and brought her in for questioning. Her initial statements were inconsistent. She alternated between claiming she had been present and then denying it. At one point, she insisted she had simply snapped. The trial that followed drew national attention. Nicole, a young college student with no prior criminal record, was now facing 2 counts of first-degree murder. Prosecutors laid out a clear narrative. Nicole hated her parents' control. She wanted freedom, and she decided that murder was the only way to get it. They described the killings as cold, deliberate, and merciless. Shooting Robert in the back of the head, they argued, showed execution-style intent. Shooting Miriam multiple times showed rage. The defense tried to paint a different picture. They highlighted Nicole's struggles with mental health, particularly depression and social isolation. They argued that she had been emotionally abused for years, living under the thumb of a domineering mother. They claimed she acted out of a mental break, not calculated malice. Expert witnesses were brought in to testify about her fragile psychological state, but the jury was unmoved. The sheer brutality of the killings and the evidence that Nicole had brought a loaded gun and executed her stepfather before turning on her mother undermined any claims of temporary insanity. In 2019, Nicole Nachtman was found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was just 25 years old when she was led away in handcuffs to begin a lifetime behind bars. The aftermath of the case left many stunned. Neighbors who had known Robert and Miriam spoke of their disbelief. Friends of Nicole expressed shock that the quiet, shy young woman they remembered could commit such a savage act. Yet in court, Nicole showed little outward remorse. Her flat, emotionless expressions became part of the story, reinforcing the narrative of a daughter who coldly eliminated her parents. What makes the case of Nicole Nachtman so chilling is not just the double murder, but the setting. This wasn't a hardened criminal in the streets. It was a young woman from a suburban home, a college student, who carried out an execution in her own house. The idea that a daughter would kill not one, but both parents in such a calculated way struck at the heart of family bonds. The case continues to fascinate true crime audiences because it raises uncomfortable questions. Was Nicole a victim of psychological abuse who finally snapped? Or was she simply selfish, willing to kill to escape her mother's expectations? Either way, the outcome was the same. Today, Nicole sits in a Florida prison, serving her life sentence. She will never walk free again. The home in Tampa, where the murders took place, has long since been sold, but for those who remember the case, it will always be the site of a brutal family betrayal. And with that act, she ensured that her name will forever be listed among the most evil daughters in history.
My dad's body's in there.
Where we find your mum?
Okay, so it's behind the bed, but back next to the sink. Cheer up, at least you caught the bad guy.
When British police finally entered a modest house in Chelmsford, Essex, in 2023, what they uncovered was something out of a nightmare. Hidden inside the home were the decomposing remains of John and Lois McCullough, both in their 70s. They had been dead for years. Forensic evidence showed they were murdered in 2019, and the person responsible was not a stranger or an intruder, but their own daughter, Virginia McCullough. Virginia had always been described as eccentric, even unstable. Neighbors recalled her as reclusive, with erratic moods. But few could have imagined that behind her closed doors, 2 bodies had been concealed for nearly half a decade. The case quickly gained international headlines as one of the most grotesque and bizarre family murders in modern British history. Investigators determined that Virginia first poisoned her father, John, in 2019. She then turned on her mother, Lois, stabbing her repeatedly before concealing both bodies in the home. Rather than report their deaths, Virginia went to extraordinary lengths to keep up appearances. She wrapped and sealed the remains, creating what prosecutors later described as makeshift tombs inside the house. Then, she simply went on with her life as though nothing had happened. For the next 4 years, Virginia maintained a twisted charade. She told relatives that her parents were unwell or unavailable. When people pressed, she claimed they didn't want visitors. To the outside world, John and Lois had simply vanished from public life. Inside their own home, their daughter was living with their corpses. But her deception went further. Virginia used her parents' bank accounts to fund her lifestyle. Investigators discovered she had siphoned off their pensions and savings, spending thousands while her parents lay dead only feet away. The financial exploitation added another layer of cruelty to an already horrific crime. What finally exposed her was a concerned relative who alerted police. Officers made a welfare check on the house in 2023. They forced their way inside and were met with the overwhelming stench of decay. In rooms sealed off by plastic, they found the bodies of John and Lois. The discovery horrified even veteran detectives. Some described it as one of the most disturbing crime scenes they had ever encountered. Virginia was arrested on the spot. In custody, she attempted to deny responsibility, claiming she had been protecting her parents. But forensic evidence was damning. Toxicology confirmed John had been poisoned. The wounds on Lois's body told the story of a brutal stabbing. There was no question. Both deaths were deliberate, and Virginia had orchestrated them. Her trial in 2024 captivated the UK. Prosecutors presented a picture of a manipulative daughter who not only murdered her parents, but desecrated their memory by hiding their bodies for years. They argued her motive was partly financial. She wanted access to their money, and partly psychological, rooted in resentment and control. The deception, they said, showed cold calculation. Virginia knew exactly what she was doing, and she maintained the lie for years. The defense attempted to argue diminished responsibility, pointing to Virginia's history of mental health struggles. They claimed she was overwhelmed, unable to cope with her parents' aging, and lost touch with reality, but the jury was unconvinced. Her systematic looting of their finances, along with the elaborate concealment of the bodies, proved she understood her actions. In March 2024, Virginia McCullough was found guilty of murdering both her parents. The judge called the crime grotesque beyond measure and sentenced her to life in prison with a minimum term of 36 years. At 36 years old, that means she will likely die behind bars. The case left an indelible mark on the British public. Stories of family murder are shocking enough, but the sheer length of time Virginia concealed her parents' bodies horrified even seasoned crime reporters. The image of a daughter living for years with the corpses of the very people who raised her struck a nerve across the UK. For John and Lois's extended family, the pain was immeasurable. They had spent years wondering why they couldn't reach the couple, only to learn that they had been dead all along, their lives stolen by their own child. Virginia's story forces difficult questions. How could a daughter poison and stab her parents, then live among their corpses without remorse? Was it pure greed, a desire for financial control? Or was it a chilling reflection of a deeper, more pathological hatred toward the people who raised her? What is certain is that the murders of John and Lois McCullough will go down as one of the most chilling family betrayals in recent British history. Today, Virginia sits in a prison cell, stripped of the freedom she so desperately tried to buy with her parents' lives. The house in Chelmsford has been cleaned and resold, but for the neighbors who remember, it will always be the place where a daughter lived alongside death, hiding one of the darkest secrets in modern England.
I believe there are couple says they have sex on Gypsy's bed, Dee Dee's body in the room next door.
He's eating a brownie. But later he will be eating me.
In June 2015, sheriff's deputies in Greene County, Missouri, responded to a strange call. A Facebook post had appeared on the joint account of Dee Dee Blanchard and her daughter Gypsy Rose. It read simply, "That bitch is dead." A second comment followed. "I fucking slashed that fat pig and raped her sweet, innocent daughter." Alarmed friends notified police, who soon entered the Blanchard home in Springfield. Inside, they found 48-year-old Dee Dee Blanchard stabbed to death in her bed. Her body was partially covered by a sheet, wounds carved into her torso. Her daughter, Gypsy Rose, who by all accounts was terminally ill, wheelchair-bound, and dependent on her mother for care, was nowhere to be found. At first, police feared the worst, a sickly, disabled girl abducted after her mother's murder. But within 48 hours, the case took a shocking turn. Gypsy wasn't kidnapped, she wasn't disabled, she wasn't even sick. She had planned the killing. For years, Dee Dee had convinced the world that Gypsy suffered from leukemia, muscular dystrophy, epilepsy, and a laundry list of other illnesses. She shaved Gypsy's head, placed her in a wheelchair, fed her through a feeding tube, and subjected her to unnecessary surgeries and medications. Doctors questioned the diagnoses, but Dee Dee always managed to silence doubt with fabricated medical histories and aggressive demands. This was Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a mental disorder in which a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in someone under their care, often to gain sympathy, attention, and financial benefits. Dee Dee was a master manipulator. She secured donations, free trips, and even a house from Habitat for Humanity, all by portraying Gypsy as a gravely ill child. Behind closed doors, life for Gypsy was a nightmare. Dee Dee tightly controlled every aspect of her existence. She kept her underfed, infantilized, and isolated. When Gypsy tried to assert independence, Dee Dee punished her with beatings, threats, and even physical restraints. Friends later recalled Dee Dee's grip on Gypsy as suffocating, describing her as both victim and prisoner in her own home. By her late teens, Gypsy had begun to see the truth. She realized she wasn't sick. She could walk. She didn't need the medications her mother forced on her. But her attempts to break free were crushed by Dee Dee's control. The tension escalated until Gypsy's desperation took a dark turn. In 2012, Gypsy met Nicholas Godijon, a man from Wisconsin, through an online Christian dating site. The two began a secret relationship. Godijon was socially awkward, with a history of mental illness and a disturbing fascination with violent sexual fantasies. To Gypsy, he seemed like her only lifeline, someone who believed her, who offered escape from her mother's suffocating grip. By 2015, the relationship had escalated into a murder plot. Gypsy persuaded Godijon to travel to Missouri. Armed with a knife, he entered the Blanchard home while Dee Dee slept. Gypsy hid in the bathroom, covering her ears. Godijon stabbed Dee Dee more than a dozen times, killing her in her bed. Afterward, Gypsy and Godijon fled to Wisconsin. The two were soon tracked down by police after investigators traced the disturbing Facebook posts to Godijon's home. Gypsy was found alive and healthy, walking on her own, a revelation that stunned the public and horrified those who had believed for years that she was terminally ill. The trial became one of the most sensational in recent memory. Prosecutors charged Godijon with first-degree murder. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Gypsy's case, however, was far more complicated. On one hand, she had orchestrated her mother's death. On the other, she was clearly a victim of years of psychological and physical abuse. Her attorneys argued that she had been pushed to the brink by Dee Dee's manipulation, that she saw no other way to escape. The court ultimately agreed. In 2016, Gypsy accepted a plea deal for second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The case ignited intense debate. Was Gypsy a murderer, or was she an abused child, finally breaking free? Documentaries, podcasts, and dramatizations explored the case from every angle. HBO's Mummy, Dead and Dearest and Hulu's The Act brought Gypsy's story to millions, sparking widespread sympathy for her plight. By the time she was released on December 28, 2023, Gypsy had served 8 years behind bars. She stepped out of prison to a media frenzy and a flood of public support. She quickly gained millions of followers on social media, positioning herself as a survivor rather than a killer. Many saw her as a symbol of resilience, a young woman who endured unimaginable abuse and paid dearly for her desperate bid for freedom. But her story remains one of the most haunting examples of how twisted family dynamics can turn lethal. Dee Dee's deception trapped Gypsy in a false life, one built on lies and manipulation. Gypsy's response, conspiring to murder her mother, destroyed both of their lives. The Blanchard case forces us to confront unsettling truths. Abuse doesn't always leave bruises that the world can see. Sometimes it's hidden under the guise of care, masked by sympathy, and ignored by those who should intervene. And when that abuse festers unchecked, it can explode into violence. Gypsy Rose Blanchard's name is now forever tied to a story of sickness, control, and betrayal. A daughter who spent her childhood being forced into a wheelchair eventually stood up, not to walk away from her abuser, but to end her life entirely. And when she did, she ensured her place among the most infamous daughters in true crime history. In the quiet town of Mansfield, England, a simple suburban home concealed a horrifying secret for more than a decade. Beneath the carefully kept garden, under layers of earth and flowers, lay the bodies of William and Patricia Wycherley. They had been shot and buried in May 1998, and no one suspected a thing. For 15 years, their daughter Susan Edwards and her husband Christopher lived off their pensions, letters, and forged signatures, maintaining the illusion that the Wycherleys were still alive. The truth, when it came out in 2013, shocked a nation. Susan, the seemingly quiet daughter, had helped orchestrate the cold-blooded murder of her own parents. Susan Edwards was not the image of a violent killer. She was shy, bookish, with an obsession for old Hollywood films and memorabilia. Her husband Christopher shared her reclusive tendencies. Together, they built a strange world of fantasy and isolation, spending beyond their means on movie star autographs and collectibles. Money was always tight, and for Susan, her parents represented both a source of conflict and a source of potential cash. In 1998, during a visit to her parents' home, the relationship fractured irreparably. According to her later accounts, an argument erupted. Her father, William, allegedly made cruel remarks about Susan's inability to have children. He taunted her over Christopher, mocking their marriage. That argument escalated into violence. Prosecutors argued that Christopher pulled the trigger, shooting William and Patricia in their own bedroom. Susan, whether or not she fired the gun herself, was part of the plan. She helped wrap the bodies and dig the shallow graves in the back garden. The cover-up was meticulous. Susan and Christopher wrote fake Christmas cards, sent letters supposedly from the Wycherleys, and even kept up conversations with neighbors about how the couple liked their privacy. They told anyone who asked that William and Patricia had moved to the coast. For 15 years, the deception held. Meanwhile, Susan and Christopher drained the Wycherleys' bank accounts. They redirected pensions, benefits, and even took out loans in their names. In total, they stole over $250,000. The money funded their collections of celebrity memorabilia, photographs, autographs, and trinkets that meant more to them than the lives they had buried in the dirt. For more than a decade, no one suspected the truth. The Wycherleys were elderly and reclusive. It was easy for the Edwardses to maintain the illusion that they had simply vanished. But in 2012, financial trouble caught up with them. Their debts mounted, and the money was running out. In 2013, Susan made a fateful decision. She reached out to her stepmother in France, confessing that her parents were buried in the garden. Her stepmother immediately contacted authorities. British police opened the Mansfield garden, and what they found stunned the community. 2 bodies, perfectly preserved by the soil, lying side by side under the flower beds. Susan and Christopher fled to France, but within weeks, they turned themselves in at the UK border. During interrogations, Susan admitted to the burials, but claimed she had been manipulated by Christopher, that she was trapped in a controlling marriage and had acted out of fear. Christopher, in turn, pointed the finger back at Susan. Their trial in 2014 was a media sensation, dubbed the Mansfield Murders, and later dramatized in the TV series Landscapers. The case exposed the strange psychology of the couple. Prosecutors described them as delusional, selfish, and greedy, 2 people who valued money and fantasy more than human life. They argued that Susan had been directly involved in planning and covering up her parents' murders, if not the shootings themselves. The defense tried to humanize Susan, portraying her as a vulnerable woman, dominated by her husband and scarred by a lifetime of emotional abuse. But the evidence of long-term fraud was impossible to ignore. The stolen pensions, the forged documents, the lies told year after year. They painted a picture of complicity, not coercion. The jury deliberated for days before reaching a verdict. Both Susan and Christopher Edwards were found guilty of murder. In June 2014, they were sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 25 years. Susan, once the quiet daughter who escaped into films and fantasy, was now branded as one of Britain's most cold-blooded killers. The case left an eerie mark on Mansfield. Neighbors who had lived next door for years were horrified to learn that 2 bodies had been decomposing just feet away, under flowers and shrubs they had admired. The ideal that a daughter could live with that knowledge for 15 years, writing fake letters in her parents' names and smiling at neighbors while collecting their pensions, was chilling. That ability to compartmentalize, to live normally while her parents lay buried in the garden, is what makes her story unforgettable. Today, Susan and Christopher sit in British prisons, serving out their life sentences. Their house in Mansfield has been resold, its garden replanted, but for those who remember, it will always be the place where a daughter buried her parents and lived off their ghostly silence for a decade and a half.
Mommy needs to eat more healthy. Yeah. No more Coca-Cola. No, Coca-Cola to that bubble.
In August 2014, tourists at a luxury resort in Bali, Indonesia, noticed a strange, blood-stained suitcase abandoned in the trunk of a taxi. When authorities opened it, they were met with a sight so gruesome it shocked even seasoned investigators. Inside was the battered body of 62-year-old Sheila van Vies Mack, an American socialite. The person responsible for the killing was not a stranger in a foreign land, but her own daughter, 18-year-old Heather Mack. Heather's relationship with her mother had been toxic for years. Sheila was a wealthy woman from Chicago's elite circles, widowed after the death of Heather's father, composer James Mack. Friends described Sheila as cultured and sophisticated, but also controlling. Heather, on the other hand, was rebellious, volatile, and often clashed with her mother's attempts to impose discipline. Police had been called to their Chicago home multiple times for domestic disputes, some involving violence. For outsiders, their relationship looked less like a mother and daughter, and more like 2 adversaries trapped under the same roof. In 2014, Sheila decided to take Heather on a trip to Bali, hoping that travel might mend their fractured bond. But far from bringing them closer together, the trip became the stage for murder. Heather had brought along her boyfriend, 21-year-old Tommy Schaefer. Sheila despised him, considering him a bad influence. The three traveled together, tensions simmering just below the surface. On August 12th, the conflict exploded inside their hotel suite at the St. Regis Resort. According to court testimony, Sheila and Tommy got into a heated argument. When Sheila insulted him, Tommy snapped. He grabbed a metal fruit bowl and beat her repeatedly in the head until she collapsed, blood soaking the carpet. Heather, prosecutors later argued, not only failed to stop the attack, but actively encouraged it. After Sheila's death, the couple stuffed her body into a suitcase, shoving it in with such force that her legs had to be bent grotesquely to fit. They wheeled the suitcase through the hotel lobby, loaded it into a taxi, and abandoned it in a parking lot. Their plan unraveled almost immediately. Hotel staff grew suspicious. Police were called, and within hours the bloody suitcase was opened. The brutality of the discovery made global headlines. Heather and Tommy were quickly arrested. In the days that followed, Indonesian police revealed shocking details. Heather was pregnant at the time of the murder. She and Tommy admitted they planned to start a new life together, funded by Sheila's money. The trial in Bali in 2015 drew international attention. Media outlets from the US and around the world descended on the courthouse. The image of a wealthy American daughter on trial for murdering her mother in a tropical paradise fascinated audiences. Prosecutors argued that Heather had manipulated Tommy into killing Sheila. They pointed to text messages showing Heather complaining about her mother, calling her controlling and abusive, and discussing inheritance money. The defense painted Heather as a victim herself, a young woman trapped in a toxic, abusive relationship with her mother and under the influence of a manipulative boyfriend. They argued she never swung the weapon, that Tommy acted alone. But the panel of Indonesian judges wasn't swayed. They saw Heather as an active participant in both the planning and the cover-up. In 2015, Tommy Schaefer was convicted of murder and sentenced to 18 years in prison. Heather was convicted of being an accessory to the murder and sentenced to 10 years. She gave birth to her daughter, Stella, in prison. The child lived with Heather in the Bali prison for the first few years of her life, before being sent back to the US. Heather's case didn't end there. After serving 7 years of her Indonesian sentence, she was released in 2021 and deported back to the United States. But upon her return, US authorities arrested her again. American prosecutors charged her with conspiracy to kill her mother abroad, a federal crime that carried far steeper penalties. In 2023, Heather pleaded guilty in the US courtroom. In 2024, she was sentenced to 26 years in federal prison. The judge described her actions as premeditated and calculated, rejecting attempts to downplay her role. Now, in her late 20s, Heather faces the reality that she will spend most of her adult life behind bars. The suitcase murder remains one of the most infamous mother-daughter crimes of the 21st century. It combines shocking violence, international intrigue, and the betrayal at the heart of family ties. The sight of a mother's body crammed into a suitcase, abandoned in a luxury resort, was an image that seared itself into headlines worldwide. For many, what made the case especially chilling was Heather's demeanor. Reporters in Bali noted that she often smiled, posed for cameras, and showed little visible remorse during her trial. To critics, it reinforced the perception of a daughter who treated her mother's murder as little more than a ticket to freedom and fortune. Today, Heather Mack sits in a US federal prison. Her daughter Stella is being raised by relatives. Sheila von Visa Mack, once a woman of wealth and culture, is remembered mostly for the horrifying way her life ended, beaten to death by a boyfriend while her own daughter stood by and then stuffed her into a suitcase. The Bali murder is a story of greed, betrayal, and brutality, set against the backdrop of paradise. It's a reminder that evil isn't confined to back alleys or shadowy strangers. Sometimes it travels with you on holiday, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the moment when family ties finally snap.
911, what is your emergency? You need to get off the radio. What's going on? Who has the knife?
My sister, and I just woke up because I was yelling.
On a cold November night in 2012, panic erupted inside the Noethel family home in Willoughby Hills, Ohio. At around 1 a.m., a terrified 13-year-old girl dialed 911. Through frantic sobs, she told dispatchers that her sister was stabbing their mother, 41-year-old Lisa Noethel. When police arrived, they found Lisa dead in her bed, her body savagely stabbed more than 150 times. Blood soaked the mattress, the walls, and the floor. Standing nearby was 18-year-old foster daughter Sabrina Zunick, still holding the knife, her clothes and hands covered in blood. It was a scene of rage and frenzy, but behind it was a story of grooming, betrayal, and manipulation that turned a teenager into a murderer. Sabrina Zunick's early life had been marked by instability. Her biological parents struggled with substance abuse, and she bounced between relatives and foster homes. By her teens, she had landed in the care of Lisa and Kevin Noethel, who welcomed her into their family. At first, it looked like Sabrina had finally found stability. Lisa was a social worker, dedicated to helping children in need, and she tried to give Sabrina a sense of normalcy. But beneath that facade, something darker was developing inside the household. Kevin Noethel, Lisa's husband, was a long-haul truck driver. Outwardly, he seemed like a devoted father figure. In reality, he was grooming Sabrina. By the time she was a teenager, he had begun a sexual relationship with her, one that authorities later described as manipulative and predatory. He convinced Sabrina that he loved her, that they were meant to be together, and that Lisa stood in their way. Over time, Kevin poisoned Sabrina's mind. He told her that Lisa was cruel, that she didn't truly care about her, and that if Lisa were gone, there could finally be a family. Kevin promised Sabrina a future, love, stability, even money from life insurance policies. He didn't need to stab Lisa himself. He had found someone vulnerable enough to do it for him. On the night of November 16th, 2012, Kevin was conveniently out of the house. Sabrina armed herself with a kitchen knife and entered Lisa's bedroom. What followed was one of the most brutal domestic murders in Ohio's history. Lisa was stabbed over 150 times as she tried desperately to fight back. The sheer number of wounds made it clear this wasn't just an impulsive act. It was a sustained, frenzied attack, fueled by months of manipulation. The 911 recording captured the terrified voice of Lisa's youngest daughter, begging for help as she watched her foster sister plunge the knife into her mother again and again. By the time police stormed the house, Lisa was gone, and Sabrina stood in shock amid the carnage. When the case went to trial, Sabrina admitted to the murder, but the courtroom quickly shifted its focus to Kevin. Prosecutors revealed his manipulation, his grooming of Sabrina, and his orchestration of the crime. He had told her exactly how to kill Lisa, when to do it, and why. Text messages and witness statements painted a damning picture of a man who exploited a vulnerable foster child to eliminate his wife. Sabrina took a plea deal, agreeing to testify against Kevin in exchange for a lighter sentence. In court, she described the twisted relationship in chilling detail. She admitted she had loved Kevin, that she believed his promises, and that she thought killing Lisa would secure their future together. Her testimony stunned the jury. In 2014, Kevin Noethel was convicted of conspiracy to commit aggravated murder, sexual battery, and corruption of a minor. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 30 years. Sabrina, meanwhile, was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 30 years. She will be middle-aged before she has any chance at freedom. The case horrified Ohio, not just for its violence, but for the betrayal at its core. Lisa Nofel had taken Sabrina into her home as a foster child, hoping to give her a better life. Instead, Sabrina became the weapon of Lisa's own husband. The story of Sabrina Zunick forces us to ask difficult questions. Was she a cold-blooded killer, or was she a victim manipulated into doing the unthinkable? Prosecutors acknowledged Kevin's influence, but insisted that Sabrina knew exactly what she was doing when she stabbed Lisa more than 150 times. The jury agreed. Today, Sabrina sits in an Ohio prison, serving her life sentence. Kevin is behind bars as well, condemned for orchestrating the murder of his wife through the manipulation of a teenager. Lisa's surviving family has spoken publicly about the devastation, how they lost not only Lisa, but also Sabrina, the girl they had once welcomed as part of their family. The Zunick case remains unforgettable because of its brutality and its betrayal. It wasn't a sudden fight or a crime of passion. It was a murder planned in whispers and text messages, carried out by a girl who believed she was following her heart. And it left a trail of blood and broken lives that will never be forgotten. On January 17th, 2023, police officers in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, responded to a request for a welfare check at a home in Jenkintown. Concerned relatives hadn't heard from Reed and Miriam Beck, both in their 70s. When officers forced their way inside, the stench of decay hit them instantly. What they found in the house was a scene of horror that even seasoned investigators struggled to process. The bodies of Reed and Miriam were discovered in separate rooms, each executed with a single gunshot to the head. But the violence did not stop there. Their daughter, 49-year-old Verity Beck, had dismembered both bodies with a chainsaw. Parts of the remains were wrapped in sheets, trash bags, and containers. For nearly 10 days, Verity had lived inside the house with her parents' mutilated corpses. Investigators pieced together a timeline. They believe the murders took place around January 7th. Sometime that night, Verity shot both of her parents at close range. The shots were deliberate, precise, and fatal. Afterwards, she began the grim task of cutting their bodies apart, perhaps in an attempt to conceal what she had done. When police entered 10 days later, the house was in chaos. Blood had soaked into carpets and walls. Power tools were scattered near the remains. Detectives found a chainsaw caked with blood and tissue. The smell was overpowering, and the scene was described in court as one of the most gruesome in the county's history. Verity was arrested immediately. During questioning, she admitted to killing her parents. She told detectives she had been under immense stress, financially broke, emotionally overwhelmed, and unable to cope with living under her parents' roof. But her explanation did not account for the brutality of what followed, the execution-style killings, and the dismemberment. Neighbors later told reporters that Verity had been a reclusive figure. She rarely left the house and seemed completely dependent on her parents. Reed and Miriam, described as kind and generous, had supported her financially for years. But inside the home, tensions were growing. Relatives testified that arguments about money and control were frequent. Some family members believed Verity resented her parents for keeping her dependent and wanted access to their savings. Her trial in 2024 riveted Pennsylvania. Prosecutors presented the killings as cold and deliberate. They pointed to the gunshots to the head as evidence of execution, not self-defense. They emphasized the cover-up, the cutting, wrapping, and concealment of the bodies as proof that Verity knew exactly what she was doing. They told the jury that this was not an impulsive act, but a calculated attempt to eliminate her parents and assume control over the household. The defense argued otherwise. They claimed Verity was severely mentally ill, struggling with paranoia, depression, and distorted thinking. Expert witnesses described her as delusional, unable to separate fantasy from reality, and emotionally crippled by years of isolation. They argued she killed during a psychological break, not with premeditation. Jurors listened to weeks of testimony. They saw crime scene photographs showing the dismembered remains, the blood-stained chainsaw, and the bags stuffed with body parts. They heard from investigators who described the sheer difficulty of processing the crime scene, and they listened to relatives who spoke about their disbelief that a daughter could live for 10 days surrounded by her parents' butchered remains. In March 2024, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty but mentally ill, on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced Verity Beck to 2 consecutive life terms. Even with the mental illness designation, she will never walk free. The sentence guaranteed she would die in prison. The case devastated the Beck family. Surviving relatives gave victim impact statements, describing Reed and Miriam as loving parents and grandparents who had dedicated their lives to family. The deaths, they said, were not only brutal, but humiliating, stripped of dignity by the actions of their own daughter. What sets the Verity Beck case apart is the level of coldness. Most parricides involve arguments that spiral out of control or crimes committed under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Verity's crime was different. Its execution-style shots showed intent. The prolonged mutilation revealed inability to carry on with daily life in a house of death. Today, Verity Beck is held in a Pennsylvania state prison. She will never leave those walls. Reed and Miriam's deaths are remembered as one of the darkest betrayals imaginable. Parents who supported their daughter financially and emotionally, only to be executed and dismembered by the person they raised.
You knew he was going to do it, didn't you? Did you?
I did it myself.
That was silly.
I got off on it.
What does that mean?
I think you should.
On March 30th, 1985, Derek and Nancy Hasten, a distinguished couple in their 50s, were found brutally murdered inside their home in Bedford County, Virginia. Derek's throat was slashed so deeply he was nearly decapitated. Nancy's body bore dozens of stab wounds and defensive injuries from trying to fight back. The house was covered in blood, a scene investigators later describe as one of the most vicious killings they had ever encountered. But what shocked the quiet community more than the brutality was the person behind it all. The murders had not been committed by intruders or burglars. They had been orchestrated by Derek and Nancy's own daughter, Elizabeth Hasten. Elizabeth grew up in privilege. Her parents were well-educated, well-traveled, and part of the international elite. Derek had been a steel executive, and Nancy had lived abroad for much of her life. They raised Elizabeth with high expectations, the best schools, the best opportunities, the assumption that she would succeed. But to Elizabeth, those expectations felt suffocating. She often described her parents as controlling, domineering, and emotionally cold. In 1984, Elizabeth enrolled at the University of Virginia. That was where she met Jens Söring, the son of a German diplomat. Jens was intelligent, awkward, and eager for approval. For him, Elizabeth was intoxicating, beautiful, worldly, and charismatic. He quickly fell in love. Their romance was intense and obsessive. Elizabeth confided in Jens about her strained relationship with her parents, portraying herself as a victim of constant criticism and pressure. She told him she could never be free as long as her parents controlled her life. Jens, eager to prove his devotion, absorbed every word. By early 1985, their conversations had darkened. Elizabeth hinted that the only way out was for her parents to die. Jens later said he believed killing Derek and Nancy was the ultimate proof of his love. Whether he volunteered or was pressured remains one of the great debates of the case. But by March, the plan was set. On March 30th, 1985, while Elizabeth remained in Charlottesville with friends to create an alibi, Jens drove to the Hastens' home in Lynchburg. That night, Derek and Nancy welcomed him in. Sometime later, he attacked. Derek and Nancy were stabbed and slashed with shocking brutality. Forensic experts later testified that the wounds suggested rage and overkill, not just quick executions. Nancy's hands and arms showed she had fought desperately for her life. Derek's near decapitation indicated a final, frenzied act of violence. After the murders, Jens returned to Elizabeth. Together, they began a frantic cover-up. They forged checks from Nancy's account and used them to finance an escape across Europe. For months, they drifted from country to country, London, Paris, Bangkok, living off stolen money and false identities. They left a trail of fraud that eventually caught up with him. In April 1986, over a year after the murders, British police arrested the pair in London for cashing stolen checks. What began as a fraud investigation quickly turned into a double homicide case once American authorities connected them to the Haysoms murders. Jens initially confessed, telling investigators he had killed Derek and Nancy to spare Elizabeth the trauma of confronting them herself. He said he acted out of love, that he couldn't bear to see her suffer under their control. But later, Jens recanted, claiming he had only confessed to protect Elizabeth from the death penalty. Believing his German citizenship would shield him, he insisted that Elizabeth had been the real mastermind, and possibly even the one who wielded the knife. The trials unfolded separately. In 1987, Elizabeth struck a plea deal. She admitted to being an accessory before the fact, acknowledging she had orchestrated the murders, but denying she carried them out. The judge sentenced her to 90 years in prison. Jens fought extradition for years, but was eventually returned to the US in 1990. He was tried and convicted of murdering Derek and Nancy Haysom, receiving 2 life sentences. He became a vocal advocate for his innocence, writing books and granting interviews in which he accused Elizabeth of manipulation and deceit. The psychological dynamics between Elizabeth and Jens fascinated the public. Was she a victim who fell into a toxic romance, or was she a manipulator who lured a vulnerable young man into committing the crime she wanted? Prosecutors argued the latter, pointing to Elizabeth's intelligence, her charisma, and her ability to twist Jens's devotion into action. Over the decades, the case continued to attract attention. Documentaries like Killing for Love and countless true crime podcasts revisited the murders, keeping the debate alive. Some portrayed Jens as a lovesick pawn, others as a willing killer. But Elizabeth's role as the architect was never in doubt. In 2019, after more than 30 years behind bars, both Elizabeth and Jens were granted parole. Jens was deported back to Germany, where he remains under supervision. Elizabeth, barred from re-entering the US, was deported to Canada. She now lives quietly, far from the place where her parents died. The murders of Derek and Nancy Haysom remain among the most infamous parricides in American history, not just because of the brutality, but because of the betrayal. 2 respected parents, slaughtered in their home, their deaths plotted by the daughter they had given everything to. Today, Derek and Nancy are remembered not for their accomplishments, but for the savage way their lives ended. And Elizabeth, no matter where she lives, will always be known as the daughter who engineered their deaths. The smiling, intelligent young woman who chose knives over family.
See the emptiness, well, she should be. So...
Hello? Hello?
On Christmas Eve, 2007, police in Carnation, Washington, a quiet, rural town outside Seattle, were dispatched to investigate a report of a family gathering gone silent. What they uncovered inside a modest home on a wooded property was one of the worst family massacres in state history. 6 people had been executed in cold blood, and at the center of it all was the daughter of the family, 29-year-old Michelle Anderson. The Anderson family had gathered that evening for a holiday celebration. Wayne and Judy Anderson, Michelle's parents, were beloved in the community. They had raised Michelle and her brother Scott in a tight-knit family. Joining them that night was Scott, his wife Erica, and their 2 young children, Olivia and Nathan, ages 5 and 3. The night should have been filled with food, gifts, and family cheer. Instead, it ended in slaughter. According to prosecutors, Michelle had been simmering with resentment for years. She believed her parents favored her brother Scott, that they dismissed her struggles, and that they owed her money. Friends later testified that Michelle often complained about being treated unfairly, that she felt disrespected, and that she carried a deep grudge against her entire family. Michelle wasn't alone in her anger. She had a boyfriend, Joseph McEnroe, who became her partner in murder. Together, they armed themselves with handguns and waited for Christmas Eve, the night when everyone would be gathered in one place. The killings began with Michelle's parents. As Wayne and Judy sat in the living room, Michelle and Joseph opened fire. Wayne was shot first, collapsing to the floor. Judy tried to run, but she too was gunned down. The two were left bleeding to death in their own home, victims of the daughter they had raised. When Scott and Erica arrived with their children, they walked straight into the horror. Michelle and Joseph ambushed them. Scott was shot multiple times. Erica tried desperately to shield her children, but she was gunned down as well. Finally, in an act that horrified even hardened detectives, Michelle and Joseph turned their weapons on the two children. Olivia and Nathan were shot at point-blank range, silenced forever by their aunt and her boyfriend. The crime scene was described as catastrophic. Blood covered the walls and floors. Christmas decorations and gifts were left untouched, a stark contrast to the carnage surrounding them. The entire Anderson family, grandparents, parents, and children, had been wiped out in a single night, save for Michelle herself. After the murders, Michelle and Joseph attempted to cover their tracks. They hid the bodies and tried to create the appearance that the family was simply out of contact. But relatives grew suspicious when no one heard from Wayne and Judy in the days after Christmas. Police eventually arrived at the property and made the grisly discovery. The investigation quickly led to Michelle and Joseph. Detectives uncovered a trail of resentment, financial disputes, and grievances that had festered for years. Michelle gave a full confession, admitting she planned the murders as revenge for perceived slights. She described her parents as controlling, her brother as selfish, and the entire family as dismissive of her. In her mind, killing them was the only way to settle the score. The trial was one of the most chilling in Washington state history. Prosecutors laid out the cold, methodical way Michelle planned and executed the murders. They emphasized the execution of the children as proof of her ruthlessness. The jury heard her taped confession, in which she admitted to carrying out the massacre without hesitation. The defense argued that Michelle suffered from mental illness, that her perception of her family was distorted by paranoia and depression. But jurors were unmoved. The sheer brutality of the killings, combined with the lack of remorse, convinced them that Michelle was fully responsible. In 2016, nearly 9 years after the murders, Michelle Anderson was convicted of 6 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her boyfriend, Joseph McEnroe, was tried separately and also received life without parole. The case left an indelible mark on Carnation and the broader community. Residents struggled to comprehend how an entire family could be annihilated on Christmas Eve, not by strangers, but by their own daughter and sister. The murders were so shocking that prosecutors originally sought the death penalty, though both Michelle and Joseph ultimately received life sentences. For many, the most haunting aspect of the case was the murder of the 2 children. Olivia and Nathan were innocent, with no part in Michelle's grievances. Their deaths highlighted the depth of Michelle's rage, a willingness to destroy not just her parents and brother, but every branch of her family tree. Today, Michelle Anderson spends her life behind bars in a Washington prison. She will never walk free, never celebrate another Christmas outside of a cell. The Anderson property has long since been sold, but for those who remember, it will forever be associated with one of the worst family murders in state history. The case stands as a chilling reminder that sometimes the gravest dangers to a family come from within. Michelle Anderson turned what should have been a night of joy into a massacre, ensuring that her name would be remembered not as a daughter or a sister, but as the orchestrator of one of the most evil family betrayals America has ever seen. Which one of these daughters chilled you the most? Was it the cold calculation of Elizabeth Haysom, the grotesque horror of Verity Beck, or Mikkel Anderson wiping out her entire family on Christmas Eve? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget, hit like, subscribe, and turn notifications on so you don't miss our next dive into the darkest crimes ever committed. Because these stories remind us of a chilling truth. Betrayal doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes the people we fear most are the ones we call family.